At one point this video was going to be Helluva Boss characters as just general Marvel villains, but then I kinda realized that all of my best ideas were Spider-Man related. Plus, at the time this video is coming out, the Spider-Man 2 game has been released and I am so hyped to play that. So even if it makes the pairing a little bit more niche and weird, I decided to try out Helluva Boss characters as Spider-Man villains. I mean, I've turned weirder things into Spider-Man villains before, like this guy right here. Anyway, let's see how this goes, shall we? Let's go. Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. New York City has more than its fair share of dangerous supervillains, but often coordinating their actions behind the scenes are various gangs and crime lords. Wilson Fisk, or the Kingpin, is one of the more well-known, and has managed on a few occasions to convince the city that he is a good man, but even still, there have been plenty of heroes and villains alike who want him dead. At one point, even his own wife. Vanessa Fisk, at a time, was a fiercely loyal wife, but had died from an illness that Fisk had failed to find a cure for, and unbeknownst to him, a group he had once temporarily run, the Hand, took her body and resurrected her, corrupting her mind to pit her against her own husband. While she concocted a few schemes to try and overthrow her husband's criminal empire, eventually she deemed it best to simply hire a worthy assassin to kill him. This was when she turned to a villain who simply went by the name Stryker. He'd been building a name for himself in the criminal underground of New York as one of the most ruthless and efficient killers around. He would do whatever his clients asked, killing his targets or even torturing them if they truly despised the person he was being sent after. Stryker never took off his mask, and any time anyone saw him, he was clad in a sort of armored cowboy attire, often using whips and revolvers to face his foes, though he was also proficient with swords, axes, and really any weapon put in his hands. Some suspected that he had a connection to Montana, a regular high-ranking thug who worked for Fisk in the Enforcers, but their only real connection was that they both had southern accents. Vanessa didn't care much for the man's gimmick supervillain attire, but she deemed he was the best person for the job and sent him after the Kingpin, saying that his death should be made slow and that she would come to see him before the death blow was laid. Of course, this gave time for New York's most famous wall crawler to learn of the ordeal. After Fisk was captured and taken by Stryker, the criminal underworld went into a panic, with some trying to take Fisk's place and others loyally fighting to maintain his throne for him until he could be returned. This alerted Spider-Man to the situation, and he was far from a fan of Fisk, but was also not in favor of capital punishment. He wanted to see Fisk locked away for his crimes, so despite feeling uncomfortable about the whole ordeal, he tracked down Stryker so that he could save Fisk from being killed. In the meantime, Stryker had taken Fisk to a cavernous lair he'd built for himself outside of New York. He deeply enjoyed his time tormenting Fisk, as Stryker had his own hatred for the crime lord and for all crime lords in the city. He thought people like Fisk cowered behind their fortresses of wealth and took advantage of people in need, desperate for money, making them go out and do his bidding, letting them take the fall for him so that he rarely had to get his hands dirty. He even stated this to Spider-Man when the web-slinger finally arrived, trying to convince Spidey to leave him be and let him continue Fisk's punishment for the life he'd led. Spidey didn't disagree with much of what Stryker said, but still felt it was his duty to keep Fisk alive and have him face a proper prison sentence. Because, that had worked out so many other times before. Surprisingly, Spidey was unprepared for how skilled of a fighter Stryker was, and got himself bound and trapped by Stryker's whip. Stryker called up Vanessa and told her that if she wanted Fisk dead, she should let him do it quick, before she arrived, because heroes like Spidey were starting to descend. But mentioning that he'd already made Fisk suffer plenty, unfortunately for Stryker, awakened a spark of Vanessa's love for Wilson, and even through her corrupted mind, it hurt her to hear that he had been harmed. She told him that the contract was off, that she'd still pay him his due, but she needed him to let Fisk go. Stryker was furious as he was very much looking forward to killing Fisk, but was always loyal to those who hired him, so he let Kingpin go and fled. But that wasn't the last time he'd be sent after a high-ranking criminal of New York City. Fizzarolli spent much of his late teens and early adult life working as a goon for Tombstone, another regular scourge of the lives of New Yorkers. He didn't have any abilities, but would occasionally try out different high-tech weapons, though he had a hard time getting the hang of them, plus he was never very good in a fight. He always preferred just being a distraction or a lookout when he was sent out on heists and jobs. There was one person that he always liked going on missions with most, the Shocker, aka Herman Schultz. Shocker appreciated the praise he got from Fitz, and they became somewhat close friends. Fitz didn't see that the Shocker was a bit of a doof compared to many of the higher-level villains on Tombstone's payroll, so he considered him to be a top-tier crook and wanted to be just like him. Until the day of the accident, that is. Fitz went out on a job with Shocker and a few other crooks. They were being sent to steal some Stark Industries tech that had already been taken by thugs of Hammerhead, who Tombstone had once worked alongside, but who now ran a rival criminal empire. Fitz tried to stay close to Shocker as they all snuck into the facility, but things pretty quickly went south. The Hammerhead goons watching the place saw them and started firing on Fitz and the others, and some of the bullets struck some of the unstable tech. Explosions erupted across the facility, setting the whole place ablaze. Fitz ended up getting pinned under a flaming crate and called out to Shocker for help. Shocker saw him and considered coming over, but more debris fell between them, and the fires were spreading farther, and so Shocker just left. Fitz was devastated that the man he'd looked up to had just abandoned him, and it seemed that his dying thoughts would be of this betrayal. But to his own surprise, Fitz hadn't died, and awoke weeks later in a laboratory with a nearly completely altered body. He was greeted by a man who called himself the Tinkerer, and by Hammerhead himself. Hammerhead told Fitz that they'd saved him despite all the damage to his body and upgraded him with some of the Stark tech that they'd taken that had survived the fire, and with knowledge the Tinkerer had of various other mechanically enhanced crooks of New York, such as Dr. Octopus and the Scorpion. Hammerhead said he knew Fitz had been one of Tombstone's guys, and that, as far as he saw it, Fitz doubly owed Hammerhead now, both for Fitz raiding his Star Call and for Hammerhead now saving Fitz's life by giving him a new semi-android body. One of his goons had also seen Fitz calling out to Shocker for help, and pressed his thumb into that wound, telling Fitz that he should want revenge on Shocker, Tombstone, and his whole organization for not valuing the lives of their own people. Fitz agreed to turn allegiances and work for Hammerhead, and while Hammerhead originally had just been manipulating Fitz as a way to belittle Tombstone, the two actually ended up growing very close. Even more so than you might think, with Fitz being fiercely loyal to Hammerhead, especially after embracing his new body. Fitz took on a cartoonish and colorful villain name as the Great Fizzarolli, and because of his love for showmanship, he'd often be the flashy frontman in Hammerhead's criminal acts, letting Fitz distract any heroes like Spiderman that may come after them, while the other goons of the organization conducted the real criminal acts behind the scenes. Fitz loved his life and his new form working as Hammerhead's right hand, though he did still harbor resentment for Shocker, and any time they came across each other in gang wars, he would always target his old idol-turned-rival to show off that Fitz had become so much more than the Shocker. Though they would eventually have a chance to mend their relationship. You see, on a day when Fitz had by chance come across the Shocker in New York's underbelly, they got into a scrap, while Fitz was unknowingly being hunted by Stryker. He'd been hired by Dr. Octopus, who at the time was going by the name of the Master Planner, trying to build a new criminal empire for himself and to take out the other gangs in New York. It was common knowledge at this point that Hammerhead had a strong bond with his right hand, and Doc Ock thought he could cripple Hammerhead's organization by capturing Fitz. Shocker also being captured at the same time by Stryker was just a bonus for Ock, and he paid Stryker extra for the two captures. What Ock didn't expect was that, while in captivity together, Fitz and Shocker would have more time to talk without trying to kill each other, and Shocker would finally apologize for abandoning Fitz in that fire, stating that he was just scared of being captured or killed in the flames himself, and that he'd hated himself for what he'd done. Once they'd talked the ordeal through and some of Fitz's bitterness had dissipated, they were able to concoct a plan together to escape. Afterwards, they still returned to their own respective gangs, but at least Fitz's resentment was fading, and he could focus more on just enjoying the good that had come to his life because of that tragic day. Now, as Shocker gained more pull in Tombstone's ranks, he was eventually given the task of creating his own team of villains. Tombstone wanted the group to be like his own version of Fisk's enforcers, but much more powerful. Shocker was struggling to pull a team like this together, until he came across a powerful, if a bit angsty individual in an unlikely circumstance. He wasn't even on the job, as he was simply walking back to his apartment one night when he heard something in an alley he passed. He pulled out his shock gauntlets and crept in to see that there were 3 SHIELD agents trying to wrangle what looked like a werewolf. As he watched on, he heard the wolf girl yelling at the agents to leave her alone, and was shocked to see how strong she was, hurling the agents across the alley with a fair amount of ease. Unfortunately, one of them got the upper hand and shoved a stun stick into her back, knocking her to the ground, with the others soon piling on top. So Shocker pulled on his mask and sent a signature shockwave across the alley to strike all 3. He ran over to the girl, helped her up, and got her out of there. They escaped, and soon after, she transformed back into a girl of roughly late high school years. She was not as appreciative of the rescue as he would have thought, but did accept an offer from him to buy her some food and learn more about her situation. They went to a quiet diner, and she said that her name was Loona Helena, and that she was a foster kid who'd been in and out of juvie for the last few years. And things had only gotten worse when her powers had awakened. She was getting better at controlling it, but in the earliest days of them, she'd spontaneously transform into a wolf woman and become rabidly violent with anyone that came near her. Not that she had such a light temper when she was human either. She'd been told that she was likely a mutant, but she suspected that she was actually the daughter of Colonel John Jameson, son of J. Jonah Jameson. John had once been cursed by a gem he found on a mission to the moon. Under various circumstances, he would then transform into a vicious wolfman, though his father at the Daily Bugle had done all he could to try and make sure various press junkets covered this up. But those who went looking could still find information about it, as he'd had some very public altercations with Spiderman. Loona had gone to confront John once, and upon mentioning her last name, taken from the single mother who'd put her up for adoption, as well as mentioning her wolf-like abilities, his face went pale. But he then swore to have no children, and that Loona must be mistaken about him being her dad. She had been convinced that he was lying and attacked him in a rage. But attacking a famous astronaut while using superhuman abilities quickly led to her being put on S.H.I.E.L.D's radar. Shocker felt bad for her, but figured they may be able to help each other out. He couldn't officially adopt her, as he had a vast criminal history, and now she essentially did too, but she could come live with him and join his budding team of crooks working for Tombstone. She could use her wolf form for something more productive, at least in his eyes, than just fleeing and fighting off S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. Loona thought Herman was kind of a sketchy guy, and was very skeptical about being taken in by some random dude, but she had few other options, and agreed, sleeping with one eye open for her first few nights in his home. But as much of an odd guy as he was, Herman truly did just end up acting like a dad to her, albeit a criminal one, helping her learn the ropes of Tombstone's organization, feeding her, and even helping her train with her abilities. They'd butt heads on many occasions over the next few years, with Loona being a very rebellious faux daughter, but even as she became an adult, she would stay with him, and they would become almost like a family, and be 2 parts of a rather successful criminal team that the Spider and others of New York's hero scene would dread facing off against in conflicts to come. If you enjoyed this, I highly recommend checking out my famous horror video game characters as Marvel Superheroes episode, or maybe my Five Nights at Freddy's animatronics as Marvel Villains episode. Or if you just want more Helluva Boss, I've got a Helluva Boss horror story video that you might like. All of those will be linked in the description and the pinned comment and stuff like that. Plus, if this video breaks 100,000 views in its first 2 weeks, I will commit to doing something like it with Has-Been Hotel characters. Or even a sequel to this, I don't know. But besides that, that is all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note, and the thought I want to leave people with is a quote that I've heard a few times, so I don't know its actual origin, but that's the idea that in 6 months, you will either have 6 months of excuses or 6 months of progress. The choice is yours. I hope that's inspiring. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next video on Friday. Goodbye.